Morning, everybody. Someone new to meditation, Zen meditation, might assume that to study Buddhism is simply to become enlightened through sitting. However, as Dogen Zenji expressed it in the Genjo Koan, what we encounter, which you've heard many times before, what we encounter first in practice is to study Buddhism, is to study the self. And then to study the self is to forget the self. Shakyamuni Buddha said that where there was no self, there was nirvana. Not experiencing the self is indeed what it takes to have an enlightenment experience. At such a moment, the self is not there. And while it will soon be back for a while, we will remain convinced that there is more to us than just this self. Trungpa Rinpoche, who was skillful at expressing traditional teachings in modern terms, called this state one of basic goodness. I like that word very much, that phrase very much, basic goodness. Basic goodness is to understand that everything is fine. Someone asked recently, well, who is enlightened if there's no self? Suzuki Roshi said that everyone has a personality unlike anyone else's anywhere else, but that it is hidden behind what we think of as ourself. What we think of as ourself, this think here is important. The self that we are aware of when fears or anxiety or worrisome problems appear in our mind is more connected to who we think we are than who we are. Anyone who advises, it's all in your mind, is referring to this self. It is not this self when we're not thinking of ourselves, or when our mind is sitting, is empty of thoughts. Though the emptiness of a mind empty of thoughts is not the emptiness which is synonymous with the absolute and is ultimately understood as being one with the relative. Gil Fronsdale, a Vipassana teacher and a Soto Zen Dharma brother, has pointed out that it is a mistake to think that emptiness is not valued in Theravadan Buddhism, as it is merely not stressed as much as it is in Zen. Liberation instead being considered foremost in Theravadan or Vipassana Buddhism. The point of Zen practice is becoming liberated as well. And while we experience emptiness in it, like its opposite form, emptiness is still a concept, and as such must be gone beyond, or else it will become something to cling to. Ultimately, this freedom from both form and emptiness is what the Heart Sutra calls unsurpassed, complete, perfect enlightenment. When prior to this, the sutra says, and the mind has no hindrances, the source of these hindrances is the self. For studying this self, the precepts are particularly useful, as they point out the types of mistakes that we are likely to fall into making, if not, of course, by killing someone or stealing a car or attacking someone sexually or lying before a judge or driving drunk, which, of course, the subjects of the first 5 precepts. but by doing something a lot less severe, such as ending the life of a spider or having the last piece of pie, or by not following the other 5 precepts, hurting someone by slandering them, praising someone in putting others down, praising oneself by putting others down, being jealous, getting angry, or doubting the teaching. The precepts are not intended to make us feel guilty about ourselves, however, or specifically to teach us to separate good from bad either, or certainly not to help us find a way to justify doing whatever we want to whenever we want to do it. Good is still good, and bad is still bad. Indeed, feeling good about oneself when having done something well is a sign of taking the self too seriously. A better internal response to a moment of success might be, well, I'm glad that worked out. To some mistake we made, our response might be, my bad. And then we should stop thinking about it, lest we end up feeling unnecessarily upset for the next few hours. What is studied then by way of the precepts is the self. Each precept representing a type of action that tends to occur when doing something solely for oneself. Having such an awareness of the precepts helps us to look more carefully at those little things in life that we do with our body, speech, and mind. Anything we do has an effect. That is, creates karma. And our acting in this way, in merely following what the self asks us to do, can lead to our having further suffering rather than in getting closer to our Buddha nature. Our study of the self isn't to try to rid ourselves of it, but the result of our discovering what the self is into will be our coming to begin to settle the self on the self. Okay, thank you. Today's talk's a little shorter, but thank you. Okay, so let me move over here to Jane. Move my cushion. All right, here we go. Oh, that. I'm sitting on. This is Jane's. Okay, there we go. All right, here we are. Sit back a little. Okay. By the way, that thing from Gilles Fonsdale was something that came to us, uh, thankfully, from Rachel. Thank you, Rachel. That was very, very, very useful. Um, yes, Daniel.
Can you distinguish the difference between the Western psychological understanding of self and the Buddhist understanding? Because they're not the same, they're different. Because it just triggers all of this confusion when you use the word self, because it seems that it's not actually about the psychological, what the understanding is in Western psychology. So could you clarify the sort of definition of self that you're using here?
Yeah, that's a good question, Daniel. That's why I decided not to use the word small self today, but the self that Buddha was talking about was not the self of Suzuki Roshi saying everybody has their own personality, and that, but but and that self is a little closer to what people think of, of having a self. When I was in high school anyway, it was, I don't know if it's true now, but it's very important to have a good personality. That's a little different than Suki Roshi, however. But yes, the self, of course, we are recommended to have a strong sense of self in Buddhist in Western psychology, so therefore this self is not about that, because having a strong sense of self in itself would not cause you to suffer necessarily. It could, by the way, if you're very confident and you get lost.
Didn't Dogen also use the word self?
Yes, okay. Oh, thank you. And yes, so this is so settle the self on the self is Dogen's, it includes two meanings of self, which we sometimes call small self and big self. Okay? But so the self that causes us trouble is the small self. And the small self is the self that is thinking only of itself, particularly in the sense of being selfish, of getting things for oneself. So the self is from that point of view is quite different, because this being selfish is not something that that Western psychology recommends. Not in a very strong sense. So this is a very particular sense of self, the selfish one. We all know it, but the egocentric, selfish, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, that's what the small self is. And so therefore, we don't try to get rid of the small self. We don't try to stop being selfish, but we don't try to get rid of the self that is selfish, but we become aware of it, because it causes ourselves so much trouble and others as well, and ultimately is not necessary. Is that good enough, Daniel?
Well, I mean, it indicates, I mean, I think listening to you talk, the sense of self, I mean, in the Chinese, I mean, or in the Japanese, I mean, I think we had a conversation, I think last night, one of the things that you mentioned is that this sense of selfishness is more self-consciousness.
That's also part of it, yes, also. Because you're putting, uh-oh, can't gotta get up and turn off my phone for me, which is now telling me the time for Zazen. Not for this, but I said it for the Zazen. Wait a second, I have to get back. Gene, it's right behind the cushion there. There it goes. That was like a timer. So she's coming back. Yeah, I know. Yeah. So,
but I mean, again, I just think that like with Dogen and with some of these, that these notions of self are deeply embedded in the culture that they come from, and they don't sometimes translate well over to our culture.
yeah, that's why, as I once again, that's true. That's true. I don't know that it's particularly based on their culture, but certainly it's different anyway. And because we can't tell whether the culture formed Buddhism, or did the Buddhism form the culture. I think possibly, so it's hard to say, particularly like in the case of the Japanese. You could argue either way, actually, but it's not important here, I don't think. But anyway, yes, Daniel, it's good to point out what that difference is. But we all know when we're being selfish. Often we think it's very natural to be selfish, and it is natural for sure. It's protecting the self, taking care of the self. It's making the self survive. It's we mentioned that last night too, right? The amygdala.
The amygdala hijack.
Yeah.
The reptile brain.
The reptile brain, yeah, yeah, yeah. So it's the reptile brain that we're talking about. And what we're doing is we study the fact that we don't impose this on ourselves. We study whether or not it's true. Does this cause us? Is that what causes us so much trouble? And at least in my case, for certain, I can guarantee you that it was and is true. Mark,
You're muted, Mark.
Hi, unmuted now.
welcome back.
Okay, so I think this is what I'm getting from both of you is that there's a self-conceptualization of self. In other words, that's something we do with our rational mind, and it seems like there's many different layers of self besides big mind, little mind, and little mind happens to have, I think, maybe our customs or cultural background, our lizard brain, our let's say habitual thinking within it, and yet big mind supposedly, in the big Venn diagram of it all, the big mind has little mind all surrounded and contained, and so, but big mind is big because we don't have enough words to explain big mind ever and what it is. So so when we're talking about settling the self upon the self, we're actually allowing this little mind to dissolve into the big mind that we actually possess and that is hiding back there all the time, but we mask it with this false facade, a mask upon our own who we are. Is that kind of what you're saying, Peter?
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. Yeah.
Any like subtleties here?
No. That's that. I think the Venn. I think the idea of the Venn diagram is a very good one. Yeah, it's like that. Yeah, because obviously everything is in the big self, and so therefore the small self is a part of it. Definitely, yeah. But it hijacks us. We get hijacked by it.
Oh, yes, because it's completely infinitely deceptive and let's say it could be a petty little self that could just, and a sneaky, devious one that never rests.
Yeah, that's right. All those things are very good. Petty is very good. Yep, that's just what it is. It's petty. It's
So,
kind of it's kind of like it's kind of like a child, actually, a small child.
yet when we behave like,
Yeah.
when we find that childlike nature within us, don't we exhibit big mind?
Yeah. There's also yes, we do. Matter of fact, sometimes children definitely do. Yeah, yeah. It seems like particularly little kids. No, it's the when the it seems like when a child has the me's when they're 2 or 3 and late twos and early threes. Of course, I never had Jane and I didn't have kids, so I don't have the personal experience with it. But I can see that it's true when they so the confusion between the self and me there and that and the me of me gimme is different. And the small self, the self that Buddha was talking about, my understand, I think, and is just that. Yeah.
I would say children are completely very, very empty in many ways and are responding to immediate concerns, and they have wants and needs, and they do seem the me's, and they do have this time where they're developing an ego. But I think it's really the adults that have the real problem with the small mind and the big mind, because the small mind grows tremendously to our self-conceptualization starts in high school years, and let me say, and definitely in the adolescent years, it's becoming a prefrontal cortex is taking over and making strategies and creating all kinds of plans and good plans, bad plans, nefarious and whatever. And I I think it's really a big adult problem we have here, because in many ways we're just big kids with heavy duty computer skills on top of it all, and we just get it really confused.
Yeah, I totally agree, Mark. That's very good. Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
And I'll rest my case right there.
Okay, okay. Rachel?
Thank you, Peter.
Thank you.
For some reason, I'm reminded a friend of mine was raised, his parents were, and grandparents actually, were deaf. And he's pretty old. And he's spoken of how the sense of self, of community, even regarding themselves versus anything exterior, was experienced differently. And he had to, in a sense, be a liaison, between them. And also, the grandparents actually were from another country. And that forever impacted, or you might say he was always curious or having to investigate because he wasn't as secure in his sense of self, either even in a personal sense, but in a cultural sense. He really learned to just sort of look at it another way because it was profoundly different living in that household. And decades later, he would say it would have formed his entire way of hearing in every sense, other people. And the reason I say that is that he wouldn't have, but I observed that certain ways he would judge or decide what to do next wasn't based so much on concepts and what someone said, but on a more, or if you like, organic, immediate sense of what was being done, like the goodness. Do you know what I mean? He wouldn't just listen to what someone said. He would watch how someone does things and listen to what was going on other than that person. And so he could respond to more than just the words that were being used by someone. And so that affected, of course, relationships throughout the rest of his life. And it just reminded me, because it does have to do with self and using words, and his rare chance to kind of question that in a way that ultimately was very helpful in orienting in his world, in a world, in this world. And but it's because that experience went through his actual living and growing up, as opposed to reading a book or thinking about what it meant to not, to be deaf or blind. And actually, as I say, he ended up being blind. So he had to have yet another way of relating to what it meant to be in the world.
Yeah.
So anyway, thank you. It just makes me really think, because we may be embedded, but we don't have to remain embedded. Even if we're always moored in whatever we're taught about the self, that embedment is not the same thing as kind of growing out of. So your roots may still be in the earth in which you were born, but you can see above you and beyond you. And thank you, Peter, very much.
Thank you. Yeah, it's there's another complication with the self, actually. In Buddhism, there are kind of two different enlightenment times. This is not what, and one is the first enlightenment, which is the enlightenment over this self. But at another level, you know, our relative world, in our case, like for example, as you know, is actually built upon language and knowledge, but particularly using our mind, and that creates the relative world. And that's also a, a, another sense of self that is beyond the sense of self of being egocentric person or thing, right? That gets us in trouble because we're grabbing what isn't real. And so that's a whole other level. But yes, but anyway, so but it's very complicated in a sense that it's hard to explain. But for example, when we refer to something else I've talked about a little bit, which is about all five skandhas are empty. All five skandhas are empty means there is no self, because all five skandhas is what creates the discrimination. So there's the discrimination self as which is different than the selfish self. It's not quite that clear, but it's there. But that is a kind of feeling that you have. So when you understand all five skandhas are empty, I mean, let's say traditionally, we may not understand that, but which is to meaning the inside and outside are not different. They aren't interfered with our thinking mind, but just our perception of being, which is not ourself here, other than the fact that that's our personality, perhaps. So it's kind of complicated. But in the first part, the part that we deal with the precepts, and the part that we deal with for a long time in our practice, actually, is dealing with this first small self, of which is a part of a larger small self also. John?
I had read, and I think that both with regards to the Western thoughts with regards to self and Buddhism, one of the things, not a problem, but one of the things that this comes back to is self-consciousness. So one of the examples that I had heard was typing. So those of us who are good at typing can sit in our office by ourselves, and when we get into a flow, we can type and the words just come out, and you can type extremely fast and it just flows. But as soon as somebody comes and looks over your shoulder, I don't care who you are, you no longer flow. It is not possible for you to continue to flow in that time. I mean, some people can still, like I can talk to people and still kind of type in the background what I was thinking before, but it's not the same thing. You lose that flow. And it's the same thing with artwork. It's the same thing with your life. It's the same thing with every day, every moment, every breath. Self-consciousness is what pulls us out of this moment. It's our anxieties about what others think about us, and all these things that have been bound up in us through millennia of just, us. Back when we were all sitting around the fire, it was anxieties about food, anxieties about society, and if people were going to like us, because if they didn't like us, we were thrown out away from the fire and you died. Do people like us? The food, all these anxieties that we have built up inside of us, that now we're in modern society, but it doesn't mean they've gone away. They've just changed and evolved and become different. We're self-conscious. And if we can just allow that feeling to happen, that happens when we are just typing and we're not self-conscious, that's kind of like, I feel, the dropping away of self that we're looking for in our day, all day, every day in our lives. And that's what kind of like we're trying to achieve also, I feel like, with our meditation, our ability to, in our lives, when we're surrounded by others and all these problems and these things are being thrown at us, are we able to go get out of that self-consciousness and be just centered in the moment still? So I think that self-consciousness is really a big part of it.
Well, I agree with you. It's not exactly the same because we can cause ourselves trouble by being self-centered, overly self-centered, I should say, probably, uh, and we don't have to have an audience. So self-consciousness often, I mean, you may have an internal audience that you see, and that makes you self-conscious also, of course. But certainly self-conscious is definitely a part of it. Yes. Yeah. Yes, Sandy.
When I first started practicing, um, I noticed, when I'm trying to sit and trying to quiet my mind, about how the small mind was always there and it was going a mile a minute, and it was offering me these stories. And, if they seemed to be more interesting than just sitting. And so I would grasp onto the stories and hold on to them, and get involved in them. It might be as simple as, what do I have to do after, I have to go shopping, I have to do this, I have to do that. But I found that over time, the small mind, as much as it causes pain, um, almost like we're willing, or at least I found myself to be um, willing to accept the pain and discomfort sometimes, just to have the voice in my head, because it seemed too scary in the beginning to not have that voice there. What do I have if that voice isn't there?
Hmm.
There's no companion telling me what's right and wrong and what I should do and what I need to do to survive. And it was kind of a scary thing to think of letting go of that, even for a few minutes. But then I had I had a first experience of what you were talking about, that everything is all right in the world. And I was just sitting and staring out my window, and a sense of peace came over me. And the sense of peace was that everything was okay in the world, even with all the terror and murder and wars. It's still, everything was okay in the world. It was as it was to be. And I didn't have to fight to survive. I didn't have to worry about the next bomb falling, because those things, they really didn't matter. Um, Whatever was going to be was going to be. It was that kind of feeling. And for a short time, I was able to connect with that feeling of everything was okay. And that feeling of everything that was okay was associated with quieting my mind. And I realized that I had been sitting there and looking at the outside greenery and totally forgetting myself. And then those feelings would come over me. So I realized that it's something that's attainable. That small mind's going to keep trying to stick its hand up there to get your attention. But I think the longer I practice, the more I realize that it's not always based in reality. It's just trying to get my attention, because that's just the way it operates. Its job is to get out there and get my attention and tell me this and tell me that. And it was obvious after a while that this is what was causing me the pain. This is what was making me feel bad. So it was easier to once I recognized that, it was easier to see it when it came up and to let it go. But it's still there. Like
It's
you
still
said,
there.
you never get rid of it. It's just how you deal with it. If you need to become aware of it.
Yeah, that's right. Thank you. Daniel?
So another diluted opinion. I'm just wondering not to try to rewrite Dogen, but I'm going to try anyway. So in other words, so to understand the adult, mature human being is not necessarily to forget the self, but to essentially grow or mature the more juvenile self, aka maybe known as small self. But it's our sort of adolescent self, one of the things that Mark was talking about. In other words, the part of ourselves, and one of the things that even John was talking about, in the sense that when we're teenagers, when we're essentially younger versions of adult, we are very self-conscious. And I think it's dangerous to say to forget that self, because that adolescent self is always going to be a part of us, warts and all. But the sense of maturing in Dharma, maturing in Buddha's wisdom is essentially to help that juvenile or adolescent self grow up and to become more mature and become an adult, enlightened human being. That's my diluted opinion.
Okay, that sounds nice. Yeah. Yeah. But yes, 1 minute. Okay, yes, Sandy. I didn't answer you, Daniel, but but go ahead, Sandy.
Can that small mind, that developed during our childhood and young adulthood, I don't think it ever grows up. I don't think it can ever mature. It's always going to be there, just the way it is. But it's the awareness of it. It's when we actually become aware of it and its function that we can grow beyond that. We can realize that it has its uses. These are my opinions, that it has its use. It will protect us when we, if we need to run away from a danger, it's going to tell you, and it's going to get your feet moving. And it helps deal with the world on a general basis, but I truly don't think it ever goes away. It will always be around, trying to get noticed, trying to fill in the gaps of empty time and not thinking. But that's just my opinion. So
Yeah, I agree. I agree. Of course, what follows to forget the self is to be. Now the translations vary a lot, but one translation is to be enlightened by all things, and that translation kind of has been changed over the years, and it seems to have become to be identified by all things. So Jane and I both have spoken about this in the past. I think I have recently actually. Is that you're if it's there's you, and that you is always you, but that you is when you're not thinking about that you're just being, not thinking about that that small self. Okay, then the world identifies you, and so therefore you are not involved in yourself. You haven't, it looks like you haven't given yourself up necessarily. You're just no longer involved with yourself. You've forgotten about the self. It's not important anymore. It's there, but not important. But what's important is your world, and you react to your world. And in reacting to your world, of course, also means when people are in that world, you help those people. That's your natural instinct comes out when you no longer care about the self so much. Then you have time to think about others. Not time, not quite right, but you just naturally do think about others. You care about others. Your feeling for others increases a lot.
So basically, that's where the bodhisattva develops
That's
compassion.
where the bodhisattva comes in. That's right. And it comes after. Now, this is once again, there's two bodhisattvas. One bodhisattva is the bodhisattva that comes after, because I've also mentioned this previously, but it's enlightened being. It's after enlightenment, you might say, which is understanding the goodness of the world, okay? Using the Vajrayana term, okay? But until that time, you're not being yourself. Yourself is the personality that no one else has. You've always been the same. I'm Peter, Jane's Jane. I'm looking at the screen right now. Mark's Mark, Chris is Chris, right? But we grow and we do develop, and that development is we realize all the taking care of ourselves is mostly not necessary. Not about eating, of course. You have to eat and sleep and all those things, and have a home, and a lot of things. But the importance that we put upon it in the past is no longer is there, and so therefore that becomes a bodhisattva. That's what an enlightened being thinks. But there's another definition of bodhisattva is we all have Buddha nature. So we actually all are enlightened beings from birth, as it were. But over the time of maturation, there are stages, and those stages now, when they're no longer necessary, then they cause us, they make us be kids again, I would say, using some of the talk that's happened here today. You have something else, Sandy?
No, that's
Okay,
pretty
good.
good. Thank you.
Anything else? Okay, buddy.